The whiskey-soaked laughter and fiddle music spilling from the Henderson barn could be heard clear across the Montana Valley. But Clara Bennett stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in lantern light, her heart hammering against her ribcage hard enough to bruise. It was September 1884, and the whole town of Copper Ridge had turned out for the harvest social. But Clara had spent the last 20 minutes convincing herself she could slip inside unnoticed, find her sister Mary, and avoid the dance floor entirely. She pressed herself against the rough wooden frame as couples whirled past in a blur of calico and denim, their boots stomping out rhythms she could feel vibrating through the floorboards, but could never seem to replicate with her own 2 feet. At 22 years old, Clara had avoided every social gathering she could manage since that humiliating night 3 years ago when she had tripped over Jimmy Mason's feet during a reel and sent them both crashing into the refreshment table, soaking half the town in punch. "You planning on spending the whole evening holding up that door frame, or are you coming inside?" The voice was warm and carried a hint of amusement, and when Clara turned, she found herself looking up into the most startling pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. The man was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore a clean white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and his worn leather vest spoke of long days working cattle. A cowboy, clearly, though she did not recognize him from town. "I was just catching my breath," Clara managed, feeling her cheeks flush hot. "It is quite warm in there." His mouth quirked into a smile that made something flutter dangerously in her chest. "It is at that." "I am Jake Mercer, just rode in this morning with a herd for the Jacobson Ranch, signed on as foreman. Clara Bennett. My father owns the mercantile." She smoothed her hands over her best dress, a deep green cotton that Mary had insisted brought out her eyes. Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so natural and courteous it made her breath catch. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Bennett. I don't suppose you would do me the honor of a dance." The flutter in her chest turned to ice-cold panic. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, and felt the familiar shame creeping up her neck. She could lie and say she was tired or that she had promised the next dance to someone else, but something about the way he looked at her, patient and genuinely interested, made her want to tell the truth. "I cannot dance," she whispered, the admission barely audible over the music. She forced herself to meet his gaze, expecting to see disappointment or worse, pity. "I never learned properly. I am all wrong feet and no rhythm." But Jake's expression did not change, except that his smile grew somehow warmer. He extended his hand, calloused palm up, and said simply, "Then we will sway instead." Clara stared at his hand for a long moment, her heart performing acrobatics that would put any circus rider to shame. Around them, the barn pulsed with life and music, but in that doorway, it felt as though the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them and his outstretched hand. "I will step on your feet," she warned, but she was already reaching for him. "I have had worse injuries from ornery cattle," he said, his fingers closing gently around hers. "I reckon I will survive." He led her not onto the main floor where the experienced dancers spun and whirled, but to a quieter corner near the back where the lantern light was softer, and fewer people would notice if she stumbled. The fiddler had switched to a slower tune, something sweet and melancholy that made Clara think of autumn evenings and changing seasons. Jake placed his other hand carefully at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance, and began to move in a simple side-to-side motion that required no complicated steps. "Just follow my lead," he murmured. "There is no wrong way to do this." Clara tried to focus on the movement, but she was overwhelmingly aware of every point where their bodies connected. His hand was warm through the fabric of her dress, steady and sure. When she inevitably stumbled, he simply adjusted his weight and kept them both upright, never once making her feel foolish. "Where did you come from?" she asked, desperate for conversation to distract from her awkwardness. "Before Copper Ridge, I mean." "Texas originally," Jake said. But I have been trailing cattle north for the better part of 5 years. Wyoming, the Dakotas, even up into Canada once. This is the first place that felt like it might be worth staying." "It only took you one morning to decide that?" Clara asked, surprised. His blue eyes found hers and held them. "Sometimes you just know when you have found something worth holding on to." The way he said it made Clara suspect he was not just talking about the town, and her pulse kicked up another notch. She had dreamed of moments like this, of a man looking at her with genuine interest instead of polite disinterest or worse, the careful patience people reserved for lost causes. But dreams were one thing, and reality was far more terrifying. "I should warn you," she said, her voice unsteady. "People around here have long memories. I once destroyed an entire social by falling into the refreshment table. You might want to be seen with someone less disastrous." Jake was quiet for a moment, and they continued their gentle swaying. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Back in Texas, when I was about 15, I was so eager to impress this girl that I tried to show off my roping skills. Ended up lassoing the tail of my boss's prize bull instead of the practice post. That bull dragged me through a mud puddle, the chicken coop, and straight through the clothesline where the boss's wife had hung all the Sunday laundry. Took me a month to earn back the money for the ruined clothes, and the whole county heard about it." Despite herself, Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest. "You are making that up." "I swear on my saddle it is the truth," Jake said solemnly, though his eyes danced with mirth. "Point is, everyone has moments they wish they could forget. But those moments do not define who we are. What defines us is what we do next." "And what did you do next?" Clara asked. "I learned to be more careful with my rope," he said with a grin, "and I stopped trying so hard to be someone I was not. Turned out the girl was not interested anyway, but I made peace with that. Figured the right person would appreciate me for exactly who I am, awkward rope skills and all." The song was winding down, the fiddle drawing out the final notes with a flourish. Clara realized with a start that she had been swaying with Jake for several minutes without once thinking about her feet. She had been so caught up in his story, in the warmth of his presence, that her body had simply followed his lead without her mind getting in the way. "Thank you," she said quietly as they came to a stop. "That was kind of you." "It was not kindness," Jake said, and there was something serious in his expression now. "It was entirely selfish. I wanted to dance with the prettiest girl at the social, and I was not about to let something like dance steps get in my way." Before Clara could formulate a response to that, Mary appeared at her elbow, breathless and flushed from dancing. "There you are. I have been looking everywhere." "Clara, you have to come help. Mrs. Henderson's punch bowl is leaking and she is in a state. You know how she gets." Clara glanced at Jake, torn between obligation and the desire to stay exactly where she was. He touched his hat again and stepped back. "Go on, I will be around." She let Mary pull her away toward the refreshment area, but she looked back twice to find Jake still watching her, that small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Her hands were trembling as she helped Mary and Mrs. Henderson transfer punch from the cracked crystal bowl into a sturdy ceramic one, and her mind was 1,000 miles away. "Who was that you were dancing with?" Mary asked in an undertone as they worked. "I have never seen him before." "Jake Mercer. He is the new foreman at the Jacobson Ranch." Clara tried to keep her voice casual, but Mary knew her too well. "And he got you on the dance floor," Mary said, her eyes widening. "Clara, you were actually dancing. I saw you. We were swaying," Clara corrected, but she could not quite suppress her smile. "It is different." "You looked happy," Mary said simply, squeezing her sister's hand. "I cannot remember the last time I saw you look that happy at a social." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Clara was pulled into conversations with neighbors and helped serve refreshments, and tried not to be too obvious about the fact that she was constantly aware of where Jake was in the room. She watched as several other girls approached him for dances, and he obliged them all with easy courtesy, but his eyes kept finding Clara's across the crowded barn. As the night wore on and families began gathering their sleepy children for the journey home, Clara found herself once again near the doorway where the evening had begun. The air outside had turned cool, carrying the promise of fall frost, and she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Leaving without saying goodbye," Jake's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him leaning against a support beam, his hat tipped back on his head. "I thought you might be busy," Clara said, nodding toward the cluster of young women who kept glancing in his direction. "Not too busy for you." He pushed off from the beam and came to stand beside her, looking out at the star-scattered sky. "I was hoping you might let me walk you home, if that would be proper." Clara's heart was doing that acrobatic thing again. "My father and sister are here with the wagon. We live above the mercantile in town." "Then perhaps I could visit the mercantile tomorrow," Jake said. "I need to pick up some supplies anyway, tobacco, maybe some ammunition." "We have an excellent selection of both," Clara said, feeling a smile tug at her lips despite her attempt at composure. "Good." Jake turned to face her fully, and the lantern light caught the planes of his face, throwing his features into sharp relief. "Clara, I want to be direct with you because life is too short for dancing around what matters. I felt something tonight, swaying with you in that corner. I would like the chance to see if there might be more to it." The directness of it stole her breath. Men did not usually speak to her this way with such open honesty about their intentions. "You do not even know me," she managed. "Then let me learn," he said simply. "Give me that chance." Clara thought about all the reasons she should say no. He was a drifter, a cowboy who had been wandering for 5 years. He would probably move on when the restlessness took him again. She would be foolish to let herself hope for anything more than a fleeting connection. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made all her careful reasons scatter like leaves in the wind. "All right," she whispered. "Come by the mercantile tomorrow." The smile he gave her was worth every bit of the fear fluttering in her stomach. "I will be there when you open the doors." True to his word, Jake was waiting on the mercantile steps when Clara came down to unlock the shop the next morning. He held his hat in his hands and had clearly made an effort to clean up, his dark hair still damp from washing. "You are a man of your word," Clara said, trying to ignore the way her pulse jumped at the sight of him. "My father always said a man is only as good as his word," Jake replied, following her inside as she propped open the door to let in the morning light. "If he breaks that, he has nothing." The mercantile smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the dried herbs Clara's mother used to stock before she passed 5 years ago. Clara had taken over much of the running of the shop since then, while her father handled the larger orders and accounts. She moved behind the counter with practiced ease, tying on her apron and beginning the morning routine of straightening displays and checking inventory. Jake browsed the shelves with apparent interest, though Clara suspected he was spending more time watching her than examining the merchandise. "Your father is not here yet," he asked. "He will be down within the hour. He has trouble with his knees in the morning since his injury last winter. Took a bad fall on the ice." Clara pulled out the ledger to record the day's transactions. "Did you really need tobacco and ammunition, or was that an excuse?" "Definitely an excuse," Jake admitted without shame. "Though I will buy some anyway now that I am here. Would not want to be caught in a lie." Despite her nervousness, Clara laughed. There was something refreshing about his honesty, the way he said exactly what he meant without games or pretense. "You are different from most men I have met. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Jake picked up a rope from one of the displays, testing the quality with hands that clearly knew their business. "I have not decided yet," Clara said, though her smile suggested she was leaning toward good. They talked as she worked, conversation flowing easily despite the newness of their acquaintance. Jake told her about his life on the trail, the vast stretches of open country and the satisfaction of working with cattle and horses. He spoke of nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and days so hot the horizon shimmered like water. "Why did you leave Texas?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. It sounds like you had a good life there. Jake's expression grew more serious. My father died when I was 19. Ranch went to my older brother, which was as it should be, but I felt restless. Like if I stayed, I would just be living in shadows, you know? I wanted to make my own way, find my own place in the world. And have you, Clara asked softly, found your place? He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. I think maybe I am starting to. The bell above the door jangled as customers began trickling in, and their private conversation had to give way to business. But Jake did not leave. He made his purchases, and then found reasons to linger, helping Clara carry in a shipment of canned goods from the back storage room, holding the ladder steady when she needed to reach something on a high shelf. By midday, when her father finally came down and raised an eyebrow at the strange cowboy who seemed to have taken up residence in his shop, Clara realized with a start that she had spent the entire morning smiling. "Papa, this is Jake Mercer," she said, wiping dust from her hands. "He is the new foreman at the Jacobson Ranch." Her father, a solid man with silver threading through his dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, shook Jake's hand with a grip that was still strong despite his bad knees. "Thomas Bennett, I hear you got my daughter on a dance floor last night." "That is a feat several young men in this town have tried and failed to accomplish." "Papa," Clara protested, mortified, but Jake just grinned. "She made it easy, sir. All I had to do was suggest we sway instead of dance." Thomas studied Jake for a long moment, and Clara held her breath, uncertain what judgment her father might pass. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Clever solution. Shows good problem-solving skills. That is an important quality in a foreman." He paused, then added, "And in a man courting my daughter, if that is what you are about." "Papa," Clara wanted the floorboards to open up and swallow her whole, but Jake met her father's eyes steadily. "I would be proud to court Clara, sir, if she is amenable to it. I know I am new to town and still proving myself, but I can promise you I have honorable intentions." Thomas looked between them, then nodded again. "Fair enough. Clara is a grown woman and can make her own choices, but know that if you hurt her, you will have me to answer to, bad knees or not." "I would expect nothing less, sir," Jake said seriously. After that, Jake's visits to the mercantile became a daily occurrence. He would stop by in the early evening after finishing his work at the ranch, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers he had found on the range, a particularly beautiful stone from the creek, once a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree, perfectly intact and intricate. They would talk while Clara closed up the shop, and if her father approved, Jake would walk her to the church social on Sunday or to visit friends around town. Copper Ridge was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and it did not take long for word to spread that Clara Bennett was being courted by the new foreman. Some of the other girls who had set their caps at Jake were clearly disappointed, but most folks seemed pleased. Clara had always been well-liked, if somewhat shy, and people were happy to see her coming out of her shell. "He is good for you," Mary said one afternoon as she helped Clara arrange a new shipment of fabric bolts. "You smile all the time now. You even hummed while you were doing inventory yesterday. You never hum." Clara ducked her head, but she could not deny it. Jake made her happy in a way she had not known was possible. He listened when she talked about her dreams of maybe expanding the mercantile someday, of adding a lending library in one corner because the town needed more books. He took her fears seriously without dismissing them, and he challenged her gently when he thought she was holding herself back. "You are smarter than half the men in this town," he told her one evening as they sat on the mercantile steps watching the sun set over the mountains. "You should not make yourself smaller just because you are afraid of taking up space." "I am not afraid," Clara protested, then reconsidered. "Well, maybe I am a little afraid. Things have not always gone well when I try to put myself forward." Jake took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in a way that still sent shivers up her arm despite the fact that they had been courting for 3 weeks now. "That punch bowl incident was 3 years ago, Clara. At some point, you have to stop letting one bad moment define how you see yourself. That is easy for you to say, Clara said, though without heat. You are confident and capable. You can rope cattle and break horses and do everything that matters out here. I can do the things I have practiced, Jake corrected, but I cannot keep a ledger worth a damn, and my biscuits are hard enough to break teeth. I cannot sew a straight seam or remember all the plants that are good for healing versus the ones that will kill you. Those are skills that matter just as much, and you have them. We all have different strengths, Clara. That does not make some worth more than others. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and allowed herself to believe him at least a little bit. How did you get so wise? Years of making mistakes and learning from them, he said wryly. Give it time. I will doubtless do something foolish that will prove I am not nearly as wise as I sound right now. But as October rolled into November and the aspen trees turned gold on the mountainsides, Jake continued to prove himself steady and true. He worked hard at the Jacobson Ranch, earning the respect of the other hands and building a reputation as a fair foreman who knew cattle and horses. He attended church on Sundays and helped neighbors when they needed an extra hand. He was courteous to Clara's father and charming to Mary, who had appointed herself as their unofficial chaperone and champion. When are you going to marry him? Mary demanded one evening as she and Clara prepared supper in the small kitchen above the mercantile. He is clearly head over heels for you, and you moon around like a lovesick calf whenever he is mentioned. We have only been courting for 2 months, Clara said, though her heart jumped at the thought. That is hardly long enough to be thinking about marriage. Mama and Papa courted for 6 weeks before they got engaged, Mary pointed out. When you know, you know. Clara sliced carrots with more force than necessary. And what if I make a mistake? What if I am not ready? What if I am a terrible wife? Mary set down the spoon she had been using to stir the stew and turned to face her sister fully. Clara Bennett, you have spent your whole life being afraid of making mistakes, but the only real mistake would be letting fear keep you from something that could make you happy. Do you love him? The question hung in the air between them. Clara thought about Jake's smile and the way he said her name, the warmth of his hand in hers, and the patient way he had taught her to sway instead of dance. She thought about how he listened when she talked and challenged her to be braver, how he made her feel seen and valued in a way no one else ever had. Yes, she whispered, I love him. Then the rest is just details, Mary said firmly. But as it turned out, there were some details that could not be ignored. In mid-November, Clara was working in the mercantile when she overheard 2 ranchers talking near the hardware section. Jacobson is selling out, one of them said, his voice low but not low enough. Got an offer from that syndicate out of Chicago, plans to take the money and move to California where the weather is easier on his lungs. Clara's hands stilled on the bolt of fabric she had been measuring. The Jacobson Ranch was one of the largest spreads in the area. If it sold to outside interests, things would change dramatically. And Jake was the foreman there, which meant his job depended on the ranch. What about the hands? The other rancher asked. Who knows? Syndicates usually bring in their own men. Local hands will likely be out of work come spring. Clara's mind raced through the implications. If Jake lost his position, he would have to move on to find other work. He might go back to trailing cattle north, following the herds wherever they led. And she would be left behind in Copper Ridge, another girl he had courted and left when the wind changed direction. She tried to tell herself she was being ridiculous, that she should talk to Jake before jumping to conclusions. But old fears were hard to silence, and by the time Jake came by that evening, she had worked herself into a state of quiet panic. You are upset, he said immediately, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone who had learned to know her well. What happened? Is it true that the Jacobson Ranch is being sold? Clara asked without preamble. Jake's face grew guarded. Where did you hear that? It does not matter where I heard it. Is it true? He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Jacobson told me last week. He wanted me to hear it from him before the rumors started flying. Yes, he has agreed to sell to a syndicate. The deal should be finalized in January. And then what? Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with the fear she was trying to contain. You move on to the next ranch, the next town. Was that your plan all along? Clara, it is not like that. Jake reached for her hand, but she stepped back, arms folding across her chest in unconscious defense. Then what is it like, Jake? You have been drifting for 5 years. What makes Copper Ridge any different? What makes me any different? The hurt that flashed across his face made her immediately regret her words, but she could not seem to stop the flow of panic and old insecurities pouring out. I should have known better than to think this could last. Men like you do not stay in places like this. You get restless and move on, and I am just the girl you swayed with at a barn dance. Stop, Jake said, and there was command in his voice she had not heard before. Just stop and listen to me for 1 minute. Clara fell silent, her heart hammering. I did not tell you about the ranch selling because I have been trying to figure out the right way to handle it, Jake said, his voice intense. I have been saving my wages since I got here, and I have been talking to the bank about a loan. There is a piece of property up near the North Pass, about 160 acres with good water and grazing. It is not much, but it is enough to start small, maybe run some cattle of my own instead of working someone else's herd. Clara stared at him, her anger deflating into confusion. You want to start your own ranch? I want to build something that lasts, Jake said. I am tired of drifting, Clara. I have been tired of it for a while now, if I am honest, but I did not have a reason to stop before. I did not have anything worth staying for. He stepped closer, and this time she did not pull away. You are not just some girl I danced with. You are the reason I am planning a future in Montana instead of riding off to the next job. You are the reason I have been hoarding every penny and talking to bankers and looking at land. Because I want to have something to offer you, something solid and real. Jake, Clara whispered, but he was not done. I love you, he said simply. I fell in love with you that first night when you stood in that doorway looking terrified but brave enough to tell me the truth anyway. I fell more in love with you every day since then. And if you will have me, I want to build a life here with you. Not an easy life, maybe, but an honest one. One we create together. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking. I am sorry I doubted you. I am sorry I let my fear get in the way of trusting what we have. Jake pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face against his chest and breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap, and the wind that always seemed to cling to him. I should have told you about the ranch sooner, he murmured into her hair. I did not want to say anything until I was sure I could make it work, but I should have trusted you with it. We both have things to learn, Clara said, pulling back to look up at him. But maybe we can learn them together. I would like that. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. Clara Bennett, will you marry me? I do not have a ring yet, and I am asking in the middle of your father's mercantile instead of somewhere romantic, but I cannot wait another moment to know if you will be my wife. Clara laughed through her tears, joy bubbling up so strong it felt like it might lift her right off her feet. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. When he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, Clara thought that maybe Mary had been right. When you know, you know. And she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be, in the arms of a cowboy who had taught her to sway instead of dance, who had shown her that there were no wrong steps if you were brave enough to move forward anyway. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Copper Ridge Church. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Mary's skilled hands to fit her frame, and carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Jake had pressed for her. The whole town turned out to witness the union, filling the small church to capacity and spilling out onto the steps. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Walsh declared, beaming at them over his spectacles. You may kiss your bride, son. Jake needed no further encouragement. He gathered Clara into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Clara looked out at the sea of friendly faces and felt nothing but happiness. No fear, no shame about past mistakes, just pure, uncomplicated joy. The wedding celebration was held in the same barn where they had first met, and this time when the fiddler struck up a tune, Clara did not hesitate. She took Jake's hand and let him lead her onto the floor, and they swayed together in their own private rhythm while around them their friends and neighbors danced and celebrated. "Are you happy?" Jake asked, his lips close to her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Clara answered honestly. The winter that followed was hard but good. Jake worked his remaining weeks at the Jacobson Ranch while finalizing the purchase of his land, and Clara continued running the mercantile with her father. They lived in a small room above the shop, saving every spare penny toward building a house on their new property come spring. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first brave crocuses pushed up through the frozen ground, they broke ground on what would become the Mercer Ranch. It was not much at first, just a simple cabin with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that Jake built with help from neighbors who came out on Sundays after church. But it was theirs, bought and paid for with honest work, and every board they nailed felt like a promise kept. Clara discovered she was pregnant in late April, and the news filled them both with a joy tempered by practical concerns about money and timing. But Jake just pulled her close and said they would figure it out together, the way they figured everything out. "Besides," he added with a grin, "I reckon a ranch needs children to really feel complete. Might as well get started." Their son was born in January of 1886, during a blizzard that made it impossible for the doctor to reach their cabin. Mary and Mrs. Henderson from the barn social served as midwives, and after 12 hours of labor that tested Clara's strength in ways she had never imagined, she held a red-faced, squalling infant in her arms while Jake wept openly beside her. "He is perfect," Jake kept saying, touching the baby's tiny fingers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so work-roughened. "Clara, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Clara's father, and he grew strong and healthy through that first year. Clara divided her time between caring for the baby and helping Jake build their ranch into something viable. It was exhausting work, but she found she loved it in ways she had not expected. She kept the books and helped with branding and learned to deliver a calf when necessary. She was still not graceful, still prone to occasional clumsiness, but out here on the ranch, those things did not matter. What mattered was determination and heart, and those she had in abundance. By the time Thomas was walking, they had expanded their herd to 50 head of cattle and were talking about building a larger barn. The Mercer Ranch was small compared to the big spreads in the area, but it was profitable and growing, and it was entirely their own creation. "Remember when you said you wanted to add a lending library to the mercantile?" Jake asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching Thomas toddle after the barn cat. "What if we built one here instead? We could open it to the whole community, have people come out on Saturday afternoons, make it a social thing." Clara looked at him in surprise. "You would want that? Books and people invading your ranch," "Our ranch," Jake corrected. "And yes, I would want that." "I want you to have all the things you dreamed about, Clara. The ranch is just a starting point, not the end goal. We can build whatever kind of life we want here." So they built the library, converting one wall of the cabin's main room into floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and putting out word that they would accept donations of books from anyone willing to share. The response surprised them both. People brought books they had carried west in wagons, precious volumes they were willing to lend to neighbors. By summer, they had over 200 books, and Saturday afternoons saw a steady stream of visitors coming to browse and borrow, to share news and visit while their children played in the yard with Thomas. The lending library became a community hub, a place where people gathered not just for books but for connection. Clara found herself at the center of it all, recommending titles and hosting informal discussions. and she realized with some amazement that she had become exactly the kind of person she had once been too afraid to even imagine being. Someone confident and capable, someone people sought out and valued. "You were right," she told Jake one night as they lay in bed, exhausted from a long day but content. "About not letting one bad moment define me, I am glad I listened to you." "You would have figured it out eventually," Jake said, pulling her close. "I just maybe sped up the process a little." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1888, a tiny red-haired thing with Clara's green eyes and Jake's stubborn chin. They named her Rose, and she grew up wild and fearless in a way that both delighted and occasionally terrified her parents. Where Thomas was cautious and thoughtful, Rose was all action and impulse, climbing trees before she could barely walk and declaring at age 4 that she was going to be a rancher like her papa. "She is going to give us gray hairs," Clara said, watching Rose attempt to rope the barn cat with a piece of old hemp rope. "Probably," Jake agreed, amused, "but at least life will never be boring." The years rolled on, each season bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to cold and had to make every penny stretch. There were droughts that tested their water supply and their faith. But there were also good years, when the calves were strong and the prices were fair, and they could afford small luxuries like a new dress for Clara or a proper saddle for Thomas. Through it all, Jake and Clara remained each other's anchor and support. They still swayed together in the evenings sometimes, moving to music only they could hear, and Jake still brought her wildflowers from the range. The love between them only deepened with time, seasoned by shared struggles and sweetened by moments of grace. When Thomas turned 18 in 1904, he announced his intention to stay on the ranch and learn the business properly. "If you will have me as a partner eventually," he said to Jake, suddenly looking uncertain despite his considerable height and broad shoulders. Jake clapped him on the back, his eyes bright with pride. "Son, there is nothing I would want more. This ranch will be yours someday, yours and Rose's if she wants it. You have earned that place." Rose, 16 and headstrong, declared that she did indeed want her share of the ranch, but first she was going to travel a bit and see something of the world beyond Montana. "I am not leaving forever," she assured her alarmed parents. "I just want to know what is out there before I settle down." Clara understood that restlessness, that need to test oneself against the wider world. It was not so different from Jake's years of drifting before he found his place. So they let Rose go with their blessing and enough money to stay safe, and trusted that she would find her way home again when she was ready. She did. 2 years later, bringing with her a young man from Wyoming who was a schoolteacher with ambitions of starting a proper school in Copper Ridge. Clara liked him immediately for the way he looked at her daughter, with respect and adoration in equal measure, and for the way Rose softened around him without losing any of her essential fierceness. They were married in the same church where Clara and Jake had said their vows all those years ago, and the whole town turned out again to celebrate. At the reception, held in the Henderson barn because some traditions were worth keeping, the fiddler played the same songs that had been popular back in 1884. "Want to dance?" Jake asked Clara, offering his hand with an echo of that first night. "I still cannot dance," Clara reminded him, though she was already reaching for him. "Good thing I am an expert at swaying then," Jake said with a grin that had not changed in 20 years. They moved onto the floor together, and Clara thought about how much had changed since that terrified girl had whispered her confession in a barn doorway. She had built a life beyond anything she had dreamed possible back then. A ranch, a family, a community that valued her. And all of it had started with a cowboy who had seen past her fear to the person she could become, who had offered his hand and promised they would sway instead of dance. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been that first time she said them. "I love you too," Jake replied, pulling her closer. "Always have, always will." Around them, their children danced with their partners, and friends laughed and celebrated, and the Montana night wrapped the barn in velvet darkness studded with stars. Clara closed her eyes and let Jake lead her in their familiar swaying motion, and she thought that if she could go back and tell that scared young woman in the doorway anything, it would be this. Sometimes the best things in life start with admitting you cannot do something and finding someone willing to help you find another way. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is whisper your truth and trust that the right person will hear it and stay anyway. The years continued to pass, gentle and swift as the creek that ran through their property. Jake and Clara grew older together, their hands becoming gnarled with work and age, their hair turning silver. But their love remained steady as the mountains on the horizon, a constant in a changing world. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1924, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by neighbors who had become family, and by the legacy of everything they had built together. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management, and Rose's husband had indeed established a school that served children from all over the county. Clara's lending library had expanded into a proper community library housed in its own building in town, funded by donations and volunteer work. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked Jake as they sat on their porch in the gathering twilight, watching their grandchildren play in the yard just as their own children had done decades before. "Back when we were young and just starting out," Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "I imagined we would build something good," he said finally. "But I do not think I truly understood how good it could be, how much joy there would be in all the ordinary moments, how much satisfaction there is in watching something you created with your own hands grow and flourish." "We were lucky," Clara said. "We were brave," Jake corrected gently. "You were brave enough to tell me the truth that first night. I was brave enough to suggest a different way. And we have been brave together every day since, facing whatever came and figuring it out as a team." "That is not luck, Clara, that is choice." Clara reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of 40 years of practice. "Then I choose this," she said. "I choose you every day for whatever days we have left." "And I choose you," Jake said, "always and forever." As the sun dipped below the mountains, and the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, laughter and conversation, and the clatter of dishes being washed. Out in the barn, the horses nickered softly, settling in for the night. And on the porch, an old cowboy and his wife swayed gently in their rocking chairs, moving to a rhythm only they could hear, just as they had been doing since that long-ago night when everything began with a whispered confession and a kind suggestion in a barn full of light and music. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues. It was quieter than that, built from small daily choices and steady devotion. But it was real and it was theirs, and it had been more than enough to fill a lifetime with meaning and joy. When Jake passed quietly in his sleep in the winter of 1926, Clara grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 42 years together, which was more than many people got, and they had made the most of every single one of those years. At his funeral, she stood straight and dry-eyed as she spoke about the man who had taught her to sway instead of dance, who had shown her that there were always other options if you were creative and brave enough to look for them. "He was the best man I ever knew," she told the gathered crowd. "And I was blessed beyond measure to be his wife." Clara lived another 8 years, staying active in the community and spending time with her growing family. She never remarried. How could she when she had already found the love of a lifetime? But she was not lonely. She was surrounded by the legacy she and Jake had built together, by the children and grandchildren who carried forward the values they had instilled, by the community they had helped to strengthen and grow. On warm summer evenings, her grandchildren would sometimes find her standing on the porch of the old ranch house, swaying slightly to music they could not hear. When they asked what she was doing, She would smile and say she was dancing with their grandfather, and somehow they understood that she was not being fanciful but simply continuing a conversation that death had interrupted but not ended. When Clara passed peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1934, surrounded by family, her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, Jake. Save me a dance." They buried her next to him on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the wide Montana sky they had both loved. And on the headstone, along with their names and dates, someone had carved a simple epitaph that told their whole story in just a few words. They swayed through life together. The ranch continued on through the generations, and the story of how it began became family legend. Great-grandchildren would ask to hear the tale of how their great-grandmother could not dance but found love anyway, and the story would be told again, keeping alive the memory of a shy young woman and a patient cowboy who had seen past her fear to the strength beneath. And sometimes, on clear autumn nights when the barn on the property was opened for community gatherings, people swore they could see two figures swaying in the corner, moving to music that had been playing for nearly a century, a testament to the kind of love that does not end just because life does. The kind of love that begins with honesty and builds through daily choice and steadiness and grace. The kind of love that started with a whispered confession and a gentle invitation to find another way, and lasted not just through one lifetime, but echoed down through the generations as a reminder that the best stories are often the simplest ones, about ordinary people who chose to be brave in small ways that added up to something extraordinary.